Baroness Kidron, who has been involved in many different activities. She's probably best known as a film director, and in that capacity has been involved with films that you probably have heard of in terms of Bridget Jones and Oranges Aren't the Only Fruit, and as a BAFTA winning director. But she also is involved with something called Film Club, which is an educational charity helping with after-school clubs. And today she's really come to talk to us about the milestones and the changes in kind of the digital environment for children. So a warm welcome to Baroness Kidron. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I am really aware that I am the last thing between you and a drink, and the room is very hot, so I apologize, and I will try and get on with it. I've been involved in the question of children's rights in the digital arena for about 7 or 8 years. When I first started, that was like being a salmon swimming upstream. I'm glad to say that there's quite a lot more weight and water behind me these days. But I was asked to speak today about why I think we need to move from an agenda, a harms agenda, and the kids are all right, laissez-faire agenda, to a much more societal approach, a much more sort of looking at what it is to have a child online and what it is to be a digital citizenship. Now, that's such a big subject. I'm just going to sort of try and say, you know, just really try and talk about the harms agenda, about this idea that kids are better than us at tech, and then move on to just a little bit about what we understand about childhood in other contexts, and why, rather than our technological understanding, it's our understanding about childhood and childhood goals that is going to help us design a better net for children. And if I don't run out of time, I'll probably get angry about industry, government, civil society, and things like that. But luckily, I don't have so long, so you may be spared that. So if you do a survey of, you know, there's a fairly unchanging list of harms that come up. Pornography, bullying, grooming, sexting, radicalization. And to be clear, those are not my top trumps, but the ones that consistently top the lists of concerns of parents and policymakers. And very often, as I do, when you try and steer the conversation away from this list to digital literacy and digital agency, childhood development, rights, well-being, or even trying to discuss the palpable signs of a generation affected by sleeplessness or social anxiety, you get what I call the pushback. It's as if meeting your childhood milestones or enjoying your rights or sleeping through the night would be nice to have, but in the meantime, we better get back to the very important work of dealing with pornographers and bullies. Now, clearly, we are all concerned about pornography and bullies, and I am very, very clear about, you know, how the ubiquitous presence of sexual violence in young people's lives and the ugliness of bullying have been amplified and strengthened by the individual devices and the portable nature of technology, and that those have really proper real-world outcomes in children's lives. But they do not sit outside of the broader needs of children and young people in the digital environment. On the contrary, I would argue that without solving the bigger question of growing up in a digitally organized world, we will never solve the problems of specific harms. And the other thing that I always try and point out to policymakers is that many young people find the harms agenda very patronizing. Their lived experience is not the same as the picture that they're presented with. I mean, for them, most of the time, digital technologies make their life convenient or social or entertaining. And this adult agenda seems to exaggerate a narrow set of circumstances and doesn't reflect their own anxieties. Now, as one teen said in one of the many meetings I had at schools, she said, if I get one more e-safety lesson about sexting, I'll take a picture of my boobs and put them online. And when the laughter actually subsided from the 60 or 70 kids in the room, it emerged that the vast majority of those present felt that e-safety was adults making themselves feel better without actually fixing any one of the problems, but meanwhile was completely tone deaf to their own experience and anxieties. And their anxieties, as I gather them and the research and so on, is social pressure to be constantly available, feeling worthless when excluded, horribly anxious about the curation of your online self, with the associated issues of self-image, personal brand popularity, excruciating shame at their public missteps, guilty about all the things they should or could or maybe said that they were going to do. But primarily this thing of being overwhelmed, tired, and spent, as if trying to fulfill the impossible demands of being present elsewhere, resting, working, whilst being on top of the competing demands of their attention, is actually truly exhausting. And these views, again and again, expressed by young people in qualitative research, quantitative research, and through my own work and experience, are constantly pushed back. So we have adult-identified harms, we have the anxieties expressed by young people, many of which can be traced back to the assumptions of the technology they're using. But before I come to that, I just want to get hold of this pervasive notion that kids are better at us than tech, and therefore the kids are all right. And when my son was 11, which was a very long time ago, he started to walk to school on his own. And the first few times I went in with him, and then he went on his own, and another parent let me know he'd arrived. Eventually, he was independent. In those first few weeks, we discussed zebra crossings, traffic lights, alternative places, alternative routes, who lived where, what to do if he got lost, sick, etc., etc. And I was very much frowned upon by other parents who thought he was too young to be alone in a hostile world. But I felt it was an acknowledgement of his growing maturity and independence. And I thought I needed to bottle my anxiety and give him the tools to deal with the most likely difficulties he would have. Interestingly, it took another 5 years before every single one of the kids went to school independently. But almost all of them, irrespective of when they became independent, at some point got lost, forgot their pass, had their phone nicked, got mugged, went AWOL for one reason or another, and gave them or their parents a horrible fright. Now, I tell that slightly boring story for 3 reasons. One is to say that there are differences of culture and practice within families, and this great sort of arms race to find a gold-plated way to bring up a child in the digital world is not going to work. There is no single way forward, and we cannot demonize different approaches. The second is shit happens. Protecting children and young people cannot be absolute under any circumstances. And the third and most important was that I did not think because he had the ability to walk, I could shove him out the door, tell him to go to school with no idea of where it was, when it started, how to get there, what he might do if he got lost, and hope to see him at dinner time, which is exactly what happens all day, every day to young people in the digital world. Childhood is a journey from dependence to autonomy, and what we offer, albeit different in different geographies, communities, cultures, and families, is a managed journey to adulthood that in most environments is understood to take the best part of 2 decades. Now, the offer of the 2.0 internet was that it would get rid of gatekeepers, that it would be a democratizing force for good, and it would do that by treating all of us equally. And whilst that is a magnificently attractive thought, it lies within it a fatal flaw. Because if we are all treated equally, then it means a child is being treated as if they were an adult. And a child is a child until they reach maturity, not until they reach for their smartphone. So I come at this from the point of view that tech is wonderful. I'm an early adopter. I actually work in tech. I work both in my film life and I actually build tech as a standalone thing. But we have presented the young with an environment that does not recognize them. We have given them unfettered access to a world designed for adult use. We've given the adult world unfettered access to our young, and we fail to understand that 2 fast thumbs and a comprehensive knowledge of Instagram filters does not make you a digital native. Using technology cannot in itself be taken as evidence that the individual child is a creative participant in the digital environment with digital literacy, agency, and citizenship. Kids are not better than us at tech, they are quicker. And if you look at the longitudinal research of EU Online about children's internet use, children consistently come at the bottom end of the ladder of opportunity. That is to say, they are least knowledgeable and least benefited by their digital use. Given that commerce, work, government, and civil society are all increasingly being delivered and organized in the digital environment, I would suggest that on that basis alone, kids are not all right. Now, the way that I have chosen to look at it, and it's come after, as I say, many years involved in this thing, is trying to help the adult world say it's not about what you know about tech, it's what you know about life, it's what you know about your kids, it's not what we know about childhood that we have to take as our guide to designing a better world. And I have found it very helpful to apply our understanding of childhood rather than our understanding of digital to fashion a better approach. And I know that my more specialist colleagues were bold, but in layperson's terms, childhood development milestones simply describe the steps that children take on their journey from being entirely dependent beings in protective arms to fully autonomous adults responsible to each other and themselves as citizens. These well-established milestones offer up snapshots of how a child might understand the world in different moments and therefore offer a clue to what structural supports they need from their environment. And I can only offer up a few glimpses. This is dozens and dozens of milestones well established by research. But for example, at age 3 to 5, they are developing a theory of mind, which means they can imagine themselves in other people's shoes, but they're still at a stage where they tend to believe all they're told. So if they tend to believe all they see, then they need to be in a digital environment that has content appropriate to their age. And additionally, they may need adult guidance to explain what they are seeing when it comes into conflict with their own experience. At 13 to 15, developments in their prefrontal cortex often contribute to an increase in risk-taking behavior. And it's a time that is characterized by idealism and polarized thinking. Well, how does access to all the world's inexplicable atrocities land in the psyche of a 15-year-old risk-taking, idealistic teen with polarized views in an unmediated environment where no context or alternative view is available? Or how about the 16 to 18 who present as adults but have not yet developed a sense of consequence, which interestingly only comes into play in your mid-20s, and where intense, intimate relationships among peers are the most predominant influence? Well, if your developmental priority is your most intimate relationship and you have no sense of consequence, what pressure might that put on you to behave in ways that are not in your long-term interest? I picked those at random, but if you extrapolate into the digital context, you can immediately see how the needs of children and the design of technology, as it is currently configured, come into conflict. And it's the designs and assumptions of the technology that is of import here. These conflicts are not created by technology. They're probably recognizable from our own childhoods. What's different here is that in the digital environment, privately owned and little regulated, is deliberately designed to extend use and to share personal information in a commercially driven gold rush that's predicated on collecting data. And that is what puts the culture and practice of the digital environment into a direct conflict with the best interests of children. Now, I can't, and I'm sure it's too hot, too late, to go into all of the different ways in which it does that. But if you just take one example, which is that most digital interaction is gamified, i.e. reward-based, tugging at your human evolutionary need to pay attention, the attention required to keep you checking in, taking action, cause someone else to react, which in turn requires to answer from you. That is the basis of almost all commercial interactions on the net. And that is of particular difficulty for young people. Psychologists call it being primed. They're being primed to gamble. It's the same technology that they use in casino slot machines. And I'll give you as an example, a 14-year-old boy who was in one of my workshops when we were designing an app, and he was designing an app to manage his own use. And he was at the time trying to maintain his streak. That is the number of days he had an interaction on Snapchat, which was several hundred days. And it included a side deal between him and his friend to babysit each other's phones when they went on holiday so they couldn't break it when they went out of contact. And he was rather rueful about the whole enterprise, and he didn't see any wrong in it at all, and he didn't think it was particularly marvelous. He was just doing it because he was doing it because everyone was doing it, which is part of the culture, that everybody's just doing it. But in the course of our work, he found out that for the previous 6 months, he had spent 32 hours a week on Snap. And he texted me later to say he'd decided to break his streak and was rationing himself. Not something I requested of him, by the way. I don't have a view on that. But he thought that if he spent 32 hours a week doing almost anything else, that he would be a genius. So he decided to recalibrate his time. And that experience is really familiar to me. Dozens of young people that I've worked with have found that the unconscious use of their time in ways that ultimately do not provide satisfaction, very, very unnerving. A lot of them get actually angry or upset, and one of them I thought rather brilliantly described himself as a rat in the lab of Silicon Valley. Now, Snap is actually a brilliant concept and in many ways more innovative and interesting than many of its competitors, but it embodies many of the technical norms of an industry built on rewards in the form of streaks, approval, responses, counter-responses, sharing, and they only have two connected purposes. The first is to keep you online at any cost in order to achieve the second, which is to gather, profile, share, sell, store your data for the purposes of then advertising to you or offering you further services for money. And as previously described, it's particularly difficult for young people to counteract the immediate demands of a highly addictive reward loop, since they are developmentally unable to see the consequences of their continued use. Now, I'm not an idiot. One boy spending his teenage on Snap is just a glimpse. But we are actually talking about a time in which 1 in 5 children report missing meals, sleep, school due to unwanted digital activity, where tech tantrums have just overtaken food tantrums as the most common family dispute. And among late teens, it's now a norm, certainly in the Western world, to sleep with your phone and be interrupted by messages and alert at a developmental time when your sleep is precious to your growth, your mental health, your academic achievements, and the lack of sleep is associated with an upswing in suicide rates. The technological norms of reward loops are just one example. Data gathering, profiling, algorithmic bias, paid for information, sharing story, that take no account of children and young people and their needs and ability for development change, nor do they deliver on our societal agreements with children. And just to be totally practical, if this seems a little bit conceptual, is why isn't it the norm to be an autoplay switch? So you can turn it off so the next video doesn't start and you don't get the tantrum. Why does Apple not allow you to disable alerts? How about if you could routinely set timeouts on all services as you log in? Why is there no under 18 system of access to services with no data gathering? Why can't kids have a real-time tracking of how their photos are being shared or their data is being sold? I mean, these are the largest, richest, the most innovative and creative companies in the world. They have the technology, they have the power, they definitely have the money. All that is lacking is the will. And I think there's great contradictions in an industry that has defended freedom of expression as the ultimate social freedom, but at the same time trades in the personal data of children, taking ownership and using profiling methods that were previously unimaginable, and designing their algorithms to turn young people into what I call digital serfs. And I think it is a failed responsibility of all of us that we've allowed our world to go digital without building in a specific requirement for our young, the way we have in other settings. And there are concepts and international agreements that provide young children and young people with rights that could easily be extrapolated into the digital environment. You know, the UNCRC is time for an upgrade. We have, I've done a lot of work on the regulation and legislation here in the UK, and so much of it that we actually do operate. I'm not talking additionality. I'm not talking about cutting kids out. I'm not talking about making a miserable world where they don't have access. But many of the rules of engagement that operate in the offline world simply are not apparent online, which is where they spend a vast amount of their time. And I think it's useful in this context to think about the notion of digital citizens, because that is now all of us who have access. And we, rather than worrying about the digital skills we don't have, should think about the societal agreements that we have made to each other and on behalf of our kids. Digital citizens are active and engaged citizens of a global digital society, a society that now has taken on many of the attributes that used to be the preserve of the nation state. And we see the digital environment as empowering and exciting for its opportunities. But it does require us to understand how the values of our communities transfer to the digital environment, and understand the pressures and opportunities afforded by the disruptions and innovations of technology. And we must question the human outcomes in a technologically organized society, and seek to understand how technology can not only help to redress the existing inequalities of the offline world, but not create and mirror them online. So, to conclude, I'd like to say this: there are practical steps in design and arrangement of our digital world that would transform its relationship to young people. And in order to take those steps, it's necessary to put children's developmental needs at the heart of design and regulation. And we have to create a digital world that respects the existence of the child user without excluding them from the digital environment. And we have to acknowledge that the digital environment is an entirely man and woman-made technology, and therefore can be designed according to our societal needs. And it's my own personal view that we have to listen to the needs and anxieties of young people and stop pushing back to a very narrow set of harms that cannot be solved until we solve the whole. Because I would suggest that the digital environment is a welcome and necessary component of a 21st century childhood, but we have to organize it to allow for childhood. Thank you.